guys doing today? Today we're discussing the great white jazz musicians and their place in the jazz canon. This is volume 3. First episode we talked about Blue Note, Prestige, and Riverside. And again, the legacy of Blue Note is so clearly entrenched in the fact that they were just documenting the desperation of these black men. Almost everything in that canon's genuine masks of the shamans. You know, just spiritual, contextually full of providence and wisdom and experience and sorrow. And it's that legacy that most people can't grasp or put a finger on even, that is what so keeps that canon of Blue Note records in such hallowed ground and reverence in most jazz collectors and in the collectible market. And it drives and fuels the cost of those records. And unlike someone who's buying an old shaman mask out of Africa, you know, an old witch doctor mask, that guy knows he's buying a vintage piece from the old tribes of the Volta River, and he knows there's a value to that mask, and that's why he's buying it. I don't think the average jazz collector says, I'm buying this old Moby record because of the genuine nature of the crying out, the protection that record, that horn provided those men. I don't think a lot of guys are getting that, seeing the historical context of the protection that this music provided for them. And it's that same dynamic that makes a lot of the white great jazz musicians, and there's a lot of them, but a lot of them have next to zero collectability, zero market value. We talked about Bill Evans on Riverside. His stuff can go for thousands of dollars, but he was pretty much living in the tribes. He was very integrated in a lot of the black sessions. Chet Baker, of course, was another one. And then you pretty much fall. Art Pepper has some value, Stan Getz. Once you get past those first 4 guys there's not a high demand or collectible market for hardly any other white musician from this era. And I think that is very illuminating. It's saying that a couple of the colonial occupiers that came there played that music well and carved a great mask, and some of them have some demand to them because they were the first white guys to really do it well, and a host of others came and started also carving those masks, and a lot of them are fucking great carvers, but it never manages to stand the test of time the same way. And I just want to drive that point home here. And this might be an awkward way to do this, but I couldn't think of another way to do it. I thought of, in my mind, 6-7 different ways I could try to present this stuff. And I thought this was just the most comprehensive, informative way to drive home my message that the black music is sacred, and the collectability of most of those records is a clear marker saying that even subliminally, subconsciously, people get that this is black music and that it has a different value when it's done by those guys. And race is such an arbitrary thing on some levels, but yet in America it's not been that arbitrary. There has been a great persecution, a great oppression, and a white guy can have a pretty tough life but never grasp what it was like living in Harlem in the 30s. You know what I mean? You can be a tough life in a white cat but not know what it was like to live in a tent city in Central Park during the Depression. You know, the blacks are always the first to get lynched, the first to get stoned, the first to get shot, the first to get arrested, the first to get lynched, the first to get burned. When that's hanging over your shoulder, buddy, that's a weight. And that mask can free you of that weight. And let's dive in. We're first going to look at ABC here. It's a label we talked about not too long ago in my series. But we're still going to take a look at some guys here. Zoot Sims, a fantastic player, a light, airy tone. His records go for okay money, but they certainly don't fetch what a Moby record does in any sense of the term. Bob Brookmeyer, Another guy who I think is jazz royalty in a lot of senses, but his records don't sell for much. Jimmy Rainey, a great guitar player. Big fan of his stuff here on ABC. This is actually the record we're listening to. This has Red Mitchell and Al Cohn and Bob Brookmeyer on it. These records don't go for a whole ton. Vinnie Burke, a great bass player, also shows up with the Bethlehem label. Another Vinnie Burke record. This is Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross, where they're doing fun kind of bebop scat vocals over standards. Herbie Green, the trombone player, makes a couple records here. Those records don't go for much. Don Elliott, who we saw at Bethlehem and we saw at Riverside, the multi-instrumentalist. He's playing French horns, trumpets, vibes, pianos, a great singer. Ends up doing stuff in Hollywood, making TV soundtracks and commercials. His records don't go for much. People don't know about Don Elliott. Dave McKenna, solo piano. Have you heard of Dave McKenna? Let me know. Edie Gourmet, featuring the orchestra of Don Costa. She doesn't have a super big name nowadays, even though I like a lot of her records. Tom Stewart Sextet, featuring Herbie Mann, Steve Lacy, Joe Puma, Dave McKenna, Whitey Mitchell, Bill Bradley, and Al Levitt. Some pretty good names on that. Tom Stewart, how big a name is he? Looks like he's playing a baritone there, or maybe a French horn, but it looks like a baritone. And this is a cool album, Music to Break a Lease, and it's it might just be a compilation record, I can't remember, but it's just a fun record. Music to Break a Lease by. Drive your neighbors nuts. Have some jazz music. That moves us on to the Jubilee label, and we talked about Jubilee not that long ago as well. And Jubilee, of course, is known because they had a couple of great Jackie McLean records. They had great Donald Byrd, Gigi Grice record. There's some great black music at Jubilee. But in between, Conrad Janis, who we saw at Riverside, the Salt City Five, you've never heard of them, Dave Remington, the Chicago Jazz Band, the Tigertown Five in Monaco, Eddie Costa with Vinnie Burke. That's the first name most people here might have heard of. Mike Kuzo, another name that some people have heard of. Kuzo and Costa are second, third, fourth string guys in the canon. All the other white cats you've never heard of. Mo Kaufman, most people have never heard of that guy. Herb Geller, he's a white cat that's got some pretty heavy footprints to him. And he's probably a second or third tier canon guy. He's pretty firmly entrenched. There's another Herb Geller. And then Lou Levy is a fine piano player. Played around the scene for a long time. But again, it's not a name that a ton of people are gonna rush out and pay big money for. Roost, we're not gonna dig too deep into this. Roost is filled with Johnny Smith records. Tons of them. Great guitar player. I love his tone. Eddie Bonamere, is it? I had a blank. I think it's Eddie Bonamere, piano player. He's a white cat. Most people aren't going to hear too much about. Again, there's Three Bones and a Quill. Gene Quill's a great little player. More Johnny Smith. There's some Stan Getz of Storyville. And Getz, of course, is one of the true stars of jazz from a white perspective. Beverly Kenny is a great little singer, but she's making fairly commercial, accessible jazz. Ruth Price, more Johnny Smith, more Beverly Kenny. Stan Getz on that. Stan Getz at Storyville. It's the sound of Stan Getz. So the Stan Getz stuff is probably the most collectible of the Roost stuff. Tony Ailes on his Long Island suite, and a little more Johnny Smith. So that wraps up the Roost imprint. You know, Roost has a ton of Roost has a ton of God damn it. Roost has a ton of Sonny Stitt and a lot of other great black players as well. Parker, Gillespie, and all the like of that. So there's no diminishing what most of these labels are doing. And signing white artists, Makes sense. So much of the population is white, and a lot of the population isn't going to buy black musicians. And again, I want to stress these white cats can all play, but it doesn't mean that a lot of them are going to stick in the jazz canon, which a lot of them haven't. Verve is a different beast a little bit. This is going to be covering some of the Norman Granz era from the late 50s. Some of these guys are absolute legends going back to the swing era, like Gene Krupa. And we'll still just do a quick flip through some of the great white records that Verve does on the same time frame. Herbie Mann, Herb Ellis, who is of course a part of the Ray Brown, Oscar Peterson trio for the longest time. Stan Getz, again, Jimmy Joffrey we talked about. Jorge Sevilla, Spanish guitar player. That's more Herbie Mann plays Afro jazz. There's Gene Krupa, more Joffrey, Krupa, Tal Farlow, another guitar player. More Stan Getz and Jerry Mulligan. More Herbie Mann. Mulligan and Paul Desmond, who's another one of the great players. Getz in Stockholm. Getz in the Cool Sound. More Louis Bellson. More Gene Krupa. There's Charlie Ventura, who we've seen again for the third time. We saw him at Regent, and we saw him just recently at one of the labels we just did. There's more Louis Bellson right there. More Stan Getz, which is a great record. Ralph Burns, along with Jazz and Philharmonica. Gene Krupa, and Buddy Rich. More Stan Getz. The Canadian Scene with Phil Nimmons Group. That's one of the rare white records that you don't see too often. As a Canadian, I've never even heard of Phil Nimmons. And then Woody Herman and his orchestra, another great player. And Woody Herman houses a lot of these great jazz cats. A lot of the young white jazz cats that are playing in the 50s, Woody Herman's different groups was kind of cutting ground for a lot of those guys. So here we are. We've got through another episode. We've looked at a few more labels and what they did with their racial makeup. And now we're going to dig into, on the next episode, our Emercy and Argo. And look at some of what their choices were. Then we're going to dig into Columbia. And then our last episode is going to leave us on the West Coast. So we got 2 more episodes to go here, guys. So I hope you guys are enjoying this. The jazz canon is something that needs to be defined and redefined all the time. Let me know what you think of these white artists should be more part of the jazz canon. You saw my dozen earlier in the first episode. The guys I said are firmly in there. And that was second and third list I made of 3 dozen guys who I think are fairly bright stars in the jazz firmament. But there's hundreds of artists that slip between the cracks, that have fallen into obscurity, that only a completist who goes out and buys discographies are going to find these records. And you listen to them and go, why isn't this more famous? Why didn't this stand the test of time? And I think my insight that I've been sharing is a large part of the reason why. So you all be safe. Hopefully we can all hang out and meet. Come to my jazz lounge at some point. You all have a great day. Safe. Be safe. Peace. Hey guys, how you doing today? This is part 4 on the great white jazz players and the jazz canon, and each label's choices racially. Were they motivated by them just being great players? Was their interest in just trying to sell some records, sell into the white American demographic? And a lot of it, I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm kind of going to let you guys make some of those decisions and calls. Let me know what you think. So we're going to look at the 2 great Chicago labels, Argo and Emercy. And they both have a great legacy of black artists. Almost all of it's in the canon, firmly entrenched. But they both sprinkle in some white artists. Some of them are top tier players. Your Zoot Sims and Jerry Mulligans. Some of them are guys that, frankly, until you start looking at the discography of these labels, you've never heard of. Some of them I think are pretty firmly outside the jazz canon and have never been reissued. But it's all kind of arbitrary, and I think a consensus among all of us is kind of what we're looking for here. So we're going to start with Argo. And there's a Zoot Sims record that comes out number 608, which is the 6th release in the Argo discography. So that's pretty early. It's a great record. It's got Zoot Sims, Johnny Williams, Gus Johnson, and Nabi Tota on the bass. That sounds like a fake name. I'm not sure. We talked about Red Rodney in my trumpet series. A fiery trumpet player with lots of energy that played with Parker, and he's actually a pretty powerful motor if you ask me. Vito Price, swinging the loop with Lou Levy, Max Bennett, Gus Johnson, Freddie Green. Sandy Mossy, The Chicago Scene, one of my favorite album covers ever, with Ira Schulman, Eddie Baker. So these are kind of Chicago minority immigrant ethnic people. Sandy Mossy, Relaxing With, a little beach shot down there on the lakeshore on the beach. Cy Toof Assignment, a fine trumpet player we mentioned briefly. Doorway to Dixie, here's another Cy Toof record where they're playing some modern take on Dixie. Don Goldie, another white trumpet player. Mary McParland, a UK piano player that we saw a lot of on Savoy. Ralph Sharon, if I recall, he might also be UK, another piano player. Dick Lane, the Dick Lane Quartet. This record was incredibly hard to find, number 615. Have you ever heard of that? You ever heard of him? There's a second Dick Lane, number 605, Without Sauce. Dick Lane, Jim West, Don Luciani, maybe, Pat Richards. Not names I've ever heard of. This is the Malvano Orchestra, My Memories. Records like this you can look up on Discogs and find nothing. I mean, not Discogs, on Wikipedia. Google image who this guy is, Malvano. I couldn't find nothing. So if you can't Google image somebody, it's pretty sick to say that that's not part of the jazz canon, but it's Argo 619. Argo 618. The Many Moods of Al Russ Orchestra. Another guy I couldn't find a picture of. Another guy I couldn't find much information on. Chet Roble. He's a piano player, if I recall. And he's a older fella here already. If I recall, he's got some kind of boogie-woogie barroom swing to his playing. But I haven't heard this record in a long time. But have you heard of Chet Roble? Heard Philoffer? Or Philoffer? I'm not sure you say that, honestly. Jazz, Argo 657. Not a record you see very often. You ever heard of him? Introducing the Bass Bonnier Trio. It's an outstanding album cover. It's actually a really good record. Not somebody you've ever heard of. Seymour and his Heartbeat Trumpet. Time is on my hands. Looks like somewhere in the Riviera, probably the French, maybe the Spanish Riviera. Great cover. Nice looking boat. But Seymour and his Heartbeat Trumpet, you don't really see that in the reissue programs, do you? Smokey Stover and his original Fireman. The Chicago Firemen's Guild had a jazz group. They're actually pretty good players. They swing pretty hard. But not part of the jazz canon. Lou McGarrity's Big 8. Trombone player. Fine record. Great player. Not somebody you hear too much about. I don't think that a lot of those records were Argo just saying, you know what, Phil Leonard Chess, we're afraid of issuing black records, because they have a long track listing of issuing black musicians, of course, and their reputation with the blacks is as bad as Lubinsky's at Savoy's. And so the white guys they issued, I'm sure they were hoping some of it would sell with white audiences, and from what I can tell, most of it didn't, and most of it's never been reissued. And even the Zoot Sims, that's a tough record to come by. Here at Emersy, and now Emersy has some of the best black recordings of the 50s. Just a huge stockpile of incredible black musicians. But they do record some white guys to varying levels of success. Jerry Mulligan here has a record, number 3656. Maynard Ferguson, the Canadian, has probably 4 or 5 records here in this sequence. I hate that outfit. I think that's probably why I thought it was a French Canadian. Looks like something you'd see with a beret, but apparently he's not a French Canadian, he's just a Canadian. Paul Bley, I'm not sure how you say that. He's also a Canadian, 36092. He ends up being part of the edgy outer avant-garde. He makes some pretty out recordings in the 60s and into the 70s. But here he's just a fiery young player. Here's a Charlie Ventura record who we've seen on a couple labels already. He's another great sax player with Buck Clayton, Neil Hefti, Charlie Shavers, Benny Green, Bill Harris. So he's got a pretty solid Kai Winding, Tony Scott. He's playing some pretty serious jazz royalty with him there. So you gotta say Charlie Ventura is definitely a part of the jazz canon. A Frenchman, if I recall, Bernard Pfeiffer, piano player. He's a great player. Terry Gibbs, he's a vibe player. He makes actually a lot of records here on Emercy, but he's got 2 in the first 100. And remember, that's kind of what we're doing, is we're going through 14 or 15 of the great jazz labels of this era and looking at their first 100 releases. We're picking out the music made by the white artists to try to evaluate what percentage of these white artists are we familiar with, how much of it's part of the jazz canon, how much of it's stuff that was probably done to placate a white audience to make a safe choice, to hopefully sell some records, and how much of that stuff has become nearly invisible today. Pete Rugolo, he's a fine player, second or third tier actually, jazz canon guy, but his name certainly is in jazz circles if you dig deep enough. Herb Geller is a fantastic player, firmly in the jazz canon, along with his records on Jubilee. Those are all solid records. Max Bruhl, sounds like a Danishman, possibly, German. Don't know too much about him. Great player. Some of this is also a dynamic of the city of Chicago. Chicago has these large immigrant groups, and immigrants are going to relate to the music of the oppressed. The struggle of the black musician, it rings out greatly with an oppressed minority group in Chicago's South Side or West Side. So Jorgen Rieg, who's either Swedish or Danish, Ralph Gary. A lot of these names are pretty obscure. Lars Gulen, who I think is Swedish. There's another Lars Gulen, a baritone player. Georgie Auld, and that name is German, but I'm not sure if he's German. Some of these guys could be second generation Americans too. Georgie Auld again. Here's John Williams, a guy whose name you see some, but not super popular. Joe Say is a piano player. He's got 2 or 3 records on Emercy. Mal Fitch, I recall, is also a piano player. Not a name you know too much about. This is Dick Johnson, who has a few records on, I think on Press Riverside he had one. I think he had another one we just saw on some label, I can't recall. And then there's the singers. Helen Merrill, no question, is one of the great jazz singers of all time. She's jazz royalty. She might not be a first-tier all-star in the jazz canon as far as everybody knows the name, but she's certainly a second-tier and one of the great jazz singers of all time. So her records are beyond repute. Jackie Paris, he's a bit of a poppy crooner, but he's got a fun jazz pop light sensibility to him. Thelma Grayson, she's a great singer. Patti Page is definitely on the lighter side. We're trying to cash in and make some commercial choices there. Morgana King, she's early in her career here. She makes some nice stuff. And then, of course, Phil Napoleon and Irving Fazoli. Those are both going to be Dixieland White Cats that are going to be all great players. All of it. You know? So the jazz canon, again, is something that we're going to work on, kind of trying to define that ourselves and as a group. So I'm curious to get some feedback from you guys on some of this stuff. We're going to do Columbia next. I'm going to pause this real quick. Hey guys. Talking Columbia now. And Columbia is actually an interesting label to look at because it cuts such a wider swath in terms of its marketing, its reach, who the music was intended to be sold to. There's such broader considerations to be made at Columbia that sometimes the regional labels, it's going to be tougher to see trends and developments because there are only certain small slices of the country and usually just a portion of that region in their region demographic. But at Columbia, which is by far the best of the major labels around the country in terms of racial tolerance and recording great black jazz musicians, and a lot of the Columbia sequence houses all the rest of the Columbia music departments, from the early country guys to some gospel stuff to bar room bluegrass to beer hall songs to it's just such a mix of music on the Columbia label from 500 through about 1400, which we're going to talk about. And I don't have a lot of it. A lot of it's not jazz in any way. A lot of it's unsellable shit. And when you look through the Columbia discography from 500 to 1400, those 900 albums that Columbia puts out from 1954 to 1960 or so, I would be shocked, and I'm not positive on this because I don't know all genres of music, but I'd be shocked if there's other records on that Columbia sequence that have more value than the jazz that's risky by the young black artists. The Blakey Messenger record, the Bert Grice record, the early Miles stuff. Those records were risky. They were shocking to America. They were a sensible militancy that the average white person could probably feel the edge to it. It was a bit like hearing hard rap in the 90s in a different context. It was still coming across as that saying, oh wow, this has edge to it, this has tension to it, this doesn't seem like it's satisfied with the status quo. And so I'm not sure, I'd have to look through the whole discography again there, but from 500, the sequence where it starts, to 1400, there's 900 records there between 54 and 60 or so. And I'd be shocked if there's a bunch of other stuff in there that's got anywhere near the collectability of those black jazz records. And there's some good white jazz records in there. The Brubeck, there's a Baker, there's a couple other things we're going to get into in a second here. But there's a lot of landfills and record warehouses filled with the Rosemary Clooneys and the Beer Hall records and the just tons of schlocky, poppy, gimmicky. Columbia was putting out all kinds of stuff, and most of it has zero value today. Zero. You can't give it away. You can't donate it. You can hope the dump will charge you to take it. You know, and certainly in jazz terms, the black records have far more collectability, far more value, and are sought after way more. But none of this is to say that white artists can't play, which I want to be clear about. None of this is to say that white artists can't be as much the improviser, as much the player, even as emotive. They could be emoting just as furiously as a black cat. They're just going to be coming from a different place, a different experience, which I've expressed umpteen times at this point. So I want to dig into here some of these great Columbia records on jazz that they've done. Benny Goodman, of course, is someone from the swing era. He made a lot of great recordings in the 30s. Harry James, the great trumpet player, plays with them for quite a long time. Goodman and James are both two of the great players to ever play this music in any era. You need to have some Goodman in your collection. That's 500. I guess the first LP Columbia issues in the LP series. I'm not sure if it's an original pressing or not, I don't recall. No, it's 6-eye, so it's probably not original. This is also a very early Columbia. If I recall, that's the green label, which is a rare Columbia logo. You don't see that one very much. But Goodman, he'll have stuff issued throughout this sequence. A lot of it's stuff from the 30s. Another guy, Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Dorsey, the Dorsey brothers, are where Sinatra made his first big mark in the world. And Columbia is comfortable with putting that swing era stuff out pretty much incessantly. along with the Ellington and Armstrong stuff as well. They're putting up the black swing artist stuff because Columbia is not threatened, because America's not threatened by black music that's 20 years old. We get comfortable with it eventually. Snoop Dogg Gin and Juice is a colorful, cartoony song to us now. But it was pretty scary, a lot of white America in 1992. Chet Baker has a nice record here with strings. And Baker's record here on Columbia doesn't go for what his stuff on Pacific does by any means. But again, stuff on Columbia is going to have sold so much better. Mulligan, this is a little later, 1307. Another fine player whose records don't go for much. Michel Legrand, the French arranger. This is actually a fairly good record with a lot of great players on it. The Danish Kai Winding playing trombone. He makes a lot of records with J.J. Johnson, but he also does some records on his own. He's a fine player without any question about it. They're worth, if you see them, they're worth grabbing for $5-10. We're never gonna get to Dave Brubeck. And Brubeck, of course, Fantasy Label. If you want to see more about Brubeck, go to the Fantasy Label episode that I made last week or so. But Brubeck had a real imprint on Columbia. He sells a lot of records at this label. Jazz Goes to Junior College is what we're listening to right now. Brubeck in Europe, Brubeck in Eurasia, Brubeck Quartet, Gone with the Wind, the Southern Scene, the Riddle, Dave Brubeck, Bernstein plays Brubeck, plays Bernstein, of course the infamous Timeout, which I think should be in every collection. The Dave Brubeck Quartet Digs Disney, Jazz Goes to College, Jazz at Storyville, is it? Yeah, Storyville, Brubeck Time. This is a really old one, Red Hot and Cool. So that's some of the Brubeck lineage there at Columbia. And Brubeck's definitely a part of the jazz canon. His stuff's all worth having. Him and Paul Desmond make such a strong impact on what the cool is, and so many people's entry point into jazz is Brubeck. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, I'd rather have people listen to Brubeck and get into jazz than have be introduced to it by some screeching stuff that's going to make them never want to come back. That's my take. Of course, Frank Sinatra is pop, jazz, and some of his records are going to be more jazzy than others depending on who's arranging it, but he is one of the great singers of all time. And this also clearly indicates, you know, what Columbia knows is going to sell. And it's going to be guys like Sinatra that are going to be the future at this point. And this is before his Capitol years, where he really sets the world on fire. But he does some great stuff at Columbia. And then, of course, Tony Bennett is a great Italian as well. And he makes a lot of great records here at Columbia. And his stuff's probably even more poppy than Sinatra's. And this is pretty much a straight pop record. Ray Conniff's Awful Nice. Just love that song. Johnny Mathis, pretty much just a pop singer. And then Rita Ray's, she's a Dutch jazz singer. She does some great stuff here. But you can see Columbia, money is going to be the bottom line. They're going to take some chance on risky art. They obviously did with Miles, with Monk, with the Jazz Messengers. But they're going to be making far more safe choices. And I'd say the Brubeck stuff, in hindsight, for Columbia, the Brubeck stuff is probably some of the more treasured stuff from that first 900, 1,000 Columbias that they issued on LP. Now we're talking. Because Columbia goes way back into the 78 era, you know. But it's the LP era we're discussing, 54 to 60 roughly, that first 5-6 years, the first 100 records by all the other labels. I want to show you what Columbia was doing at that same time frame. And so it's largely Brubeck, Sinatra, Bennett, a few other guys, and there's a sprinkling of black musicians in there. But most of the black musicians don't start showing up on Columbia, aside from Ellington and Armstrong, until 58, 59 with the Messengers in 58, and then Miles in 57, 58. And so they start taking some chance on black musicians. And again, those records are the ones that are treasured. Those are the records on Columbia that go for good money. And Columbia's sold well. They're distributed all over the world for the most part. And like I said, most of the Columbia discography has zero value. And it's the jazz that is risky and that takes a chance. And oftentimes that music is black. And white artists can make an impact and do wonderful things. And a lot of them are firmly within the jazz canon. But race economics are a huge part of all this. And a lot of, it's amazing how many white musicians got a chance to record jazz. Thousands of them are given a shot. You know, to play a black man's music. White guys just were given opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. And a fraction of them have staying power. A fraction of them have collectability. A fraction of them had something really to say beyond virtuosity, beyond a label trying to make money. And that's the difference. The canon somehow is a saber that knows the integrity of the art. Somehow it can sight through and decide and decipher the viability, the genuine expression. And I think so many of the consumers have no grasp of it. And I still stumble on debates all the time about white and black, and there's no discernible difference between a black and a white musician, and how they blindfolded Little Jazz, Roy Eldridge, and he made a lot of wrong calls as to what was white or black. But again, the African mask can be carved just as beautifully by an imitator. It might sound and look the same, but it won't feel the same. And if the spirit and the soul of the artist is lacking, the staying power will be too. That's just the bottom line. When you express art out of desperation from the bottom of your soul to try to find your way through the fire, even a naive person who can't grasp what you're doing can somehow feel it and connect with that art. In spite of their lack of empathy, in spite of their lack of history, in spite of their lack of grasping your condition and your experience, without contemplating your environment, without knowing your personality, somehow they can hear you, John Coltrane, and feel your sorrow. Somehow they can feel you, Lee Morgan, and know you had something to say. Somehow they can hear Dexter Gordon and recognize that there's a power in that. And that's the missing ingredient that's so difficult to quantify and to put it into a formula. The magic of consciousness, of soul, of art, of spirit. It's not something you can just plug in. And that wraps up Columbia. We got one more chunk I want to get into now, and it's the West Coast guys. And so we're going to get to that next episode here. I'm going to put it together in a little bit. You all have a good day, and be safe on the Jazz Shepherd. Peace.